Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and today I'm back with some more discussion of Vietnam and romance comics. Now, I've got a lot of different stories from different time periods, and I was trying to figure out what to do, but I decided to go with one of the earliest romance comics set in Vietnam that I've found so far. Not the earliest, but one of the very earliest. And that's this. It's Love Diary number 43 from Charlton. Now, this has a cover date of May 1966. So it probably came out in January of 1966. And it's got this great cover. Dear Diary, we were so happy, so much in love. But now my heart has stopped. I don't want to go on living. My man is dead. And, it's got, the couple kissing in the dream up here, but then down here we have the telegram telling her that her husband has just been killed in Vietnam. So, great cover. This comic has two different stories about Vietnam in it. Very, very different stories, but both quite telling in terms of the way they present things very early on in the escalation in Vietnam. So this, the Gulf of Tonkin was in 64. So 65 is when we're really seeing the escalation. And so the U.S. presence is getting much larger at this point, but it's still not nearly what it's going to be in a couple years. The first thing I need to tell you about this is that this issue has some of the worst art in it. Like, the absolute worst art. 3 different stories, 3 different artists. The first story is not a Vietnam story, but I'm just going to give you a tease of the artwork in here. So here's a panel. Okay. That's not nearly the worst of the art in here. So here we have the cover story. My man is dead. You can see the artwork here. It's signed Waldinger. And this story is basically this woman gets a telegram that her husband's died, and there's several pages while she's reacting to the telegram. Like 4 pages. And there's some good work here. Like, the line work is not great, but the storytelling is decent. I really like this upper tier of panels, the close-up of the eye. Basically, she thinks back of all the good times, but now her days are done. Happiness is over. It's all horrible, and the artist doesn't seem to quite be, how do I put this? The writer, I think, is trying really hard to make this emotional. The artist, not so much, because in the middle of her crying about her husband, we get this panel down here. You see that panel where she's literally crying over spilt milk? So the artist is having some fun at the expense of the story. And then when we get to page 4, she faints and collapses. And she's like, people rush in, they find her, they bring her, and now she's in the hospital room, and she's not feeling well, and she thinks to herself, she just can't wait to be dreaming because she gets to see her husband again. And then finally the doctor shows up, and he's like, what's the problem? And she's like, I've been feeling sick and nauseous and dizzy. And he's like, well, you're pregnant. So what? Now, where's your husband? And she's like, that was really rude because I just learned that he died. And the doctor's like, oh crap, sorry. But then she basically says at the end here, I prayed to God to help me. I couldn't stand the thought of being alone the rest of my life without John. Now God has answered my prayer. I won't be alone. Our lives haven't been wasted. I'm going to have John's baby. Life is worth living again. I mean, in some ways, it's a very cookie cutter sort of sentiment. With a lot of these stories, I don't necessarily feel that the writer is trying to put forward a message. The next story we're going to get to, the writer is very specifically, intentionally putting forward a message. But in stuff like this, it's easy to read more into the story than I think is intended. But I think it's still valuable to look at what assumptions the writer is going on without knowing it. Because a couple things strike me here. First of all, there's just the classic romance comic reinforcement of the woman's role in society, which is to say she feels like their lives have been wasted because he died before they could have a family. And once she finds out that she's pregnant, now she feels like she's fulfilled her purpose on Earth, which is to bear children. But in terms of Vietnam, there's also this sort of it gives it this happy ending where she's so upset that her husband's died, but there's this sort of, the message like underneath is that it's okay that, you know, yes, your husbands may, or your boyfriends may go off and get killed in Vietnam, but it's okay because the family will survive. And there's a message of, fundamentally a message of reassurance despite the sadness. And we see that a lot in these earlier Vietnam stories. Not nearly so much in the later Vietnam stories. So that's interesting. Then we get a story called An Unusual Girl. And we get art like this. Like that. And that's not an anomaly, because the art looks like this. Like that. And like this. And then, yes, you're seeing the guy, they're arguing, and so he just grabs her and slings her over his shoulder. There's a lot to unpack in this story, so let me just tell you what the plot is. And the plot is that there's this woman who's sort of this flighty woman, and of course, being flighty and just an airhead, she's fallen in with the anti-war crowd. Now, again, this is the beginning of '66, so we're not talking about the much bigger protests in '67 and '68 in particular, and the later stuff. This is actually pretty early for this sort of content, quite early. But she is an anti-war protester, and she goes to this function, and this guy is her date who she's just meeting. It's like a blind date sort of setup, where it's like a friend of a friend or something. And they go to this thing, and she's talking about how horrible it is in Vietnam, and we shouldn't be sending our people there. He gets angry at her and humiliates her in public by just grabbing her and flinging her over his shoulder. And then they get outside and they start arguing, and he kisses her. He's like, he goes, she's ranting about how he should be picketing and protesting with her. And he goes, why don't you shut up? And she goes, what did you say? He goes, I said shut up. You don't know. Don't talk about Vietnam when you don't know a thing about it. And she says, you can't say that to me. And he goes, well, there's only one thing left to do. And he grabs her and he kisses her. And her thought balloon is, he believes in direct action. So she's excited by this, by being yelled at, humiliated, and belittled in public by this complete a-hole. And so basically they go to this thing, and it turns out that he is a Vietnam vet who has come back because he's wounded. And so he goes to this anti-war rally, and this horrible artist drew this guy so it looks like some sort of weird combination of a Quaker, Abe Lincoln, and Mo Howard, who's leading this thing. And the guy jumps up in the middle of the meeting and tells them all that they have no idea what they're talking about. He says, most of you are people who hate war, so you listen to guys like this who tell you things you like to hear. There isn't any easy remedy in Vietnam or Southeast Asia. We've got to fight communism out there. We've got to help the Vietnamese fight to keep the Reds from stealing their country. Our boys out there want to stay there and fight. They know the Reds will starve the Vietnamese after they gain control. They'll take the rice crop, execute the leaders on a local and national level, and make life a lot more miserable than it is right now. And she says, Chad, I didn't know you were out there. You must think I'm an awful fool. And he says, what people don't realize is that professional soldiers hate war more than anyone because they know how horrible it is. And then they make out. So we have a very clear political agenda here. Telling the readers that protests are bad and the protesters are dumb because they don't understand the real world. And that if they understood, like the soldiers on the ground do, they would know that the communists are evil and that it's our duty to stop them from destroying all the peaceful Vietnamese, none of whom clearly want anything to do with the communists. There's a lot to unpack here, and part of me doesn't even want to, because, obviously I've talked before, my father fought in Vietnam, and I've read a lot of stuff about Vietnam. I've seen a lot of interviews with veterans, and it's a very complicated, but the stuff the guy's saying here about how all the people there, they want to fight to save the Vietnamese. I'm not sure how many of the people over there that were drafted and were sent over there really wanted to be fighting at all. But putting all that aside, it's interesting again to look at the earlier propaganda versus the later stuff. And this is as one of the earliest ones and one of the most blatant ones. It's interesting to see the messaging that's being delivered by the writer, by the publisher, and basically that it has to be echoing, I hesitate to even say the conservative viewpoint of the war, because I think at this point it was still the mainstream viewpoint. Things hadn't really shifted like they're going to do in '68. I think this is a common sentiment at the time. It's interesting. There's another issue that I can't think of it immediately, but when I find it, I'll do another video about it, because this is not the only Charlton romance issue that has the same story, where we see the woman being part of the protests and the man having to set her straight because she doesn't understand how the war works. We're going to see that again. In a broader sense, there's lots of romance comics, not just from Charlton, that have that same basic idea, that the weak women are on the protester side, the liberal side, protesting against whatever it is. So there's a lot of other stories where they're protesting for equality, whether it's women's rights or whether it's racial equality, and the guy is always the one who's on the wrong side, and the woman usually ends up switching sides. Sometimes there's two men and there's one who's like the hippie, but we don't have that here. But it's a common trope across all of these. We don't see that again nearly as much once we get into the romance stuff from the early 70s that are dealing with Vietnam. We see many more stories, as we've already seen in a couple of videos, that are about the impact of the war on the people left behind in the home front. But at this point, there's still a clear pro-war messaging that's being delivered that I find problematic in a lot of ways. And I'm saying that as someone who was not alive at the time and didn't live through it. So, but from my experience as growing up with a Vietnam veteran, I don't know. Obviously, I'm biased. I have some issues with this, but it's fascinating to read this as a historical document of documenting what pop culture felt at the time about the war effort. So I went on really long about this one, but there's a lot here, including the absolutely hilariously bad artwork. It's not the worst artwork I've seen in Charlton Romance, but I think I've seen other things from that same artist where he's done even worse than that. There's some really hilariously bad artwork in some of these early mid-60s Charlton books. So next time around, we'll be bringing you more Vietnam stories. Of course, that's what this whole sequence is about. I think next time there's a full issue story in Charlton where the whole comic is one big Vietnam story, and it's very different from a lot of these. It's from the 70s. So we'll look at that one next time. Until then, let me know what you think down below. Hopefully we won't get too politically heated. After all, these things did take place a long time ago. But let me know what you think. And thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.